Will you join me in a word of prayer? O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Resolved. There is no such thing as a church without conflict. Resolved. A healthy relationship of any kind contains some degree of conflict. Resolved. Saying resolved at the beginning of a debate makes literally no sense. Okay, before I begin my message today, a few things I want to get straight. As I mentioned at the beginning of worship, every time I have preached this text, someone meets me right at the door and says, "What's going on, Pastor?" Assuming that I would only preach on a text about church conflict if we had something that was about to explode. But I can say that to this day, even though I preached this text in many churches and many times, I have never done so in the midst of a conflict. It's much better reflected on when we are not in a conflict, so we can learn and prepare ourselves for when, not if, but when conflicts arise. That is to say, there's no drama, don't worry. Second thing I want you all to know is, I wonder who all was in the debate club. Anyone in the debate club when you were? Okay. So I wondered if I'd be surprised by any of those. Not really. I was not in the debate club, and I have just enough knowledge to not really know anything but to make a bunch of mistakes and pretend that I do. But what I do know is that often when a debate begins, the debater will begin their argument by saying resolved. And I wondered about that because resolved or resolution should end a debate, it seems, not begin it. But upon research, I found that it is a shorthand for "be it resolved," as one states the issue for debate, similar to making a motion. That's why I began our service today by saying just straight facts that you could probably argue with, but offering those. But I was thinking about that and the ways in which the church structure uses Robert's rules to make motions. So we usually make motions at our council meetings or at our annual meeting that we have once a year to approve different things. And so today I so move that when it is above 90 degrees, communion should be served in the form of popsicles. No seconds? Oh, I got a second. I didn't know if I would. Lizzie's not on council, so I don't know if she gets that vote. So in a debate where one begins with resolved, it is a stating of the opinion or issue so that dialogue can then ensue and ideally lead to being resolved or finding a resolution. Those are our two words for our sermon series for today that we are in, the sermon series of Re-Church, as we make our way into the new frontier of the pandemic, which is in this place and time living with COVID as much as we had hoped to be beyond it now. We are asking what it is to re-church, to be church again after 17 months of remote worship, what it means to be church when many of our members have moved away or are connecting online, what it means to be church when miles and time separate us. We have already spent time in this series talking about renew and return, rejoice and recreation. And today we find these two related words, resolved and resolution. Both seem easy enough to define, as we have done, kind of taking the RE prefix separate from the word. Resolve, to solve again, maybe? Or resolution, to find a solution again? I guess that would make sense for New Year's resolutions because we never really follow them, so we have to keep making the same resolution again and again and again. But I think our hope is that once we solve a problem or find a solution, that we don't need to go back to it again. It is complete. But what I found in looking up the etymology of these words is that they differ from solve and solution, not because they imply reaching the end goal again, but instead describe a process to work through an issue. Like stating resolved means be it resolved, or when we say conflict resolution. These words are an invitation into conflict, but not just any invitation, a specific kind. The actual definition of resolution is reducing parts into a simpler form, while the definition of resolve is to loosen, to untie, to release, which is exactly what we hear in our text for today. Jesus is laying out a process of conflict with a few assumptions that are worth naming. First, that conflict will happen. It'll happen in the church. It will happen in marriage. It will happen in friendships. It will happen in families. It will happen at work. It will probably even happen at the grocery store or at the playground. Jesus wouldn't be offering a 3-point plan to deal with conflict if conflict wasn't a natural part of human beings gathering together. So we need to remember that, even embrace it. Similar to what Jackie was saying, when I offer premarital counseling to couples, I usually ask them to give me an example that we can work through, an example of a conflict they have that is still unresolved. And once in a while, I get a couple that says, "Oh, we never fight." And I have to be careful that my eyes don't roll too far back into my head when I hear that they'll get stuck. We all fight. It doesn't have to be about something big. Usually conflicts are around something small, like socks left on the floor or dirty dishes in the sink. But over time, those small things, if not dealt with, can do great harm to a relationship if one is just trying to keep avoiding those conflicts because they don't want to rock the boat. I usually tell those couples that it's not about not fighting, it's about fighting fair, fighting with love. That is what Jesus is outlining for us here. If there is a conflict, name it. Basically say, okay, be it resolved, and then state the problem. But at the beginning, as Jesus says, state that problem just to the other person that you have an issue with. And then Jesus goes on to say, if that person does not listen to you, and Jesus says, if they don't listen. He didn't say if they don't agree with you or tell you you're right about everything. He says if they don't listen, then gather 2 or 3 people, not to witness against the person you have a conflict with, but to witness the dialogue. And if they still don't listen, this is speaking particularly to conflicts within the church, again, that word listen, then bring in the assembly or the church. And if that doesn't work, Jesus says, well, then you can just treat them like you would tax collectors and Gentiles, which sounds like he's saying good riddance, until we remember how Jesus treated tax collectors and Gentiles with patience and grace and intentionality and love. Remember Zacchaeus? Jesus went and ate at his house and still expected the best from him. Zacchaeus was a tax collector, or the many Gentiles that Jesus listened to and healed and loved. After all, this passage comes right after Jesus says, if 1 sheep out of 100 gets lost, you go and find that one. So there's no writing each other off if the conflict continues, but instead doing the work to right the relationship if possible. And then Jesus says, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Jesus actually said this almost the same line 2 chapters earlier to Peter in regards to the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Loose, as in resolve. Yesterday, I witnessed a team building our new labyrinth that I am so excited about. For the last few weeks, I've been sharing with different people my enthusiasm for Ethan's project. And Monday, I even took one of our church members to walk a labyrinth in another part of town to help him understand what a labyrinth is and why we would have a labyrinth. And I do hope he learned a little bit in our field trip, but also as I was busy explaining the history of the labyrinth and some of the different ways you can walk a labyrinth by either letting go of things and as you walk in and picking up what God's gifts are to you on the way out, or focusing on a word, or just being present with your feet or your breath, I realized that as I did my own labyrinth walk, for me, it was a time as I moved through the turns and twists of unraveling, almost, but in the best way. It was almost a loosening. I don't think I'm alone in that I can get wound up pretty tightly, so that even God, the God who can do all things, has a hard time getting in. This metaphor is common nowadays. We talk about how we get stuck on a thought or a worry and we spin about it and think about it again and again, or even worse, we spiral, which seems to imply a movement away from health and wholeness, away from God. Maybe better said than the labyrinth unraveled me, it unwound me as I moved close through the turns, as I moved along the path. I found my spirit opening to God, my spirit opening to peace. It was a loosening, reminding me that I don't have to cling to every thought or item on my to-do list or worry or situation that I happen to know about. Doesn't mean I forgot the struggles of the world, but I held them differently as I walked out of the labyrinth. I held them looser. It's like the difference between when you grab some sand and you squeeze really tight and make a fist with your hand and all of it just falls out, as opposed to if you grab the same amount of sand and you hold it with your hand open, some of it will stay. The loosening that took place as I walked the labyrinth was reconciling with my inner conflict, but the same can be true for our struggles with one another. Binding and loosing is the way we resolve, the path of resolution. We bind ourselves to God and to love, to what matters most, and we can loosen ourselves, open ourselves to the other. Listening, as Jesus says, is the goal in the conflict resolution that he is guiding us toward. He does go on to say that we should forgive, and forgive not just once, but 70 times 7 times. But that starts with not agreeing on everything. It doesn't start with agreeing on everything, but with loosing. Within my first year here as your pastor, the book group read a book by Krista Tippett called Speaking of Faith, which was a conversation about how to have sacred conversations across political divides before the Kirk was talking about having sacred conversations about political divides. There was one part of that book that has stuck with me. I could almost tell you the page number because I have gone back to it so many times. In the book, she speaks of the conflict and the issue of reproductive rights, stating that we all know in that issue where we will end up at the end of the day. Anti-abortion or pro-choice, we are fixed so tightly to the conclusion that we have seen no movement in our division as a country on this issue for years, if not decades. And she asks, but what if? What if we loosed just a bit? Not letting go or disregarding our strongly held convictions, but opening ourselves up enough to discuss our own questions and discomfort, even with the side that we know at the end of the day we will land on. With this new law in Texas, I keep seeing memes that seem to be trying to speak reason into this polarizing issue, but a meme is not dialogue. Instead, people need to ask questions and listen and loose. Asking those in support of the law if neighbors suing neighbors is really an answer to their prayers. But also listening to the concerns of those who are anti-abortion and the way they understand the issue as a way of speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves. We together have to dive into the complexities, ask others about their understanding of healthcare mandates and childhood poverty, and be open to middle roads of more support of adoption or birth control with the hope that they might be open to understanding that abortion is wrapped up in racism and poverty and access to health care and women's autonomy. If we all would loose just a bit on this very, very polarizing issue, there just might be many paths forward instead of only one with perceived winners and losers. Resolve, resolution. Remember, I said resolution is reducing parts into simple forms. So in this example, it's not taking the full issue of abortion, but opening it up loosing the conversation, exposing nuance, listening, and understanding. And the same wisdom that we gain from Scripture doesn't only apply to hot-button issues. I think we collectively didn't know what to do with yesterday, as the 20th anniversary of 9/11 seemed to come out of nowhere. Because our world is so different. It feels like it was so long ago and then not at all. But still, we wanted to make room to create space for grief for those who lost loved ones, and for stories of heroism and bravery, kindness and healing. But that too is a loosing. The healing from any tragedy, and unfortunately we have known far too many tragedies since 9/11, is all about loosing. Folks say that grief is another form of love. And yet much of the reaction to 9/11 didn't feel like love. There was anger and fear. Articles this week expressed that many of our Muslim neighbors are still fighting bias that began on 9/11. We must loose the fear and the anger, and at the same time bind ourselves to the love that is at the root of our grief, the love of neighbor, the love of life, the love of public servants. Loose hostility, bind love. There's a song that I heard for the first time in January of this year. Yes, the January of this year, and it knocked me over with its wisdom and truth. It is about loosing and binding. I loved it so much, I did everything I could to get it into the first worship service I could, and so Lizzie and Kathy sang it for us on our remote worship in March, but I wanted us to hear it again. Greg and the music team are going to teach it to you in a moment, but the words, the first part of it says, loosen, loosen, baby. You don't have to carry the weight of the world in your muscles and bones. Let go, let go, let go. It is a call and it is a reminder that we are not the Messiah, that Jesus is. And we are invited to loosen, to open ourselves up to the ways in which God works in us and through us. But the second part of the song is the binding. Holy breath and holy name, will you ease this pain? It is our calling out, our asking for help when we need to, binding ourselves to God and one another, and knowing that we don't do any of this work alone. And so I'm so excited for you all to hear and learn this song. I don't want it to just be something we sing at church. Ever since I learned it, it accompanies me when I walk the labyrinth, or when I do the dishes, or when I am overwhelmed by the weight of the world. Let us loosen and bind. I hope that you carry this song in your muscles and bones, and that it fills your spirit as it has mine.
Loosen, loosen, baby, you don't have to carry the weight of the world in your muscles and bones. Let go, let go.